This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have 12 noon. My name is Keegan Goodrich, VP of Communications and Events with BC Hockey. Just some housekeeping items, as always. We have muted everybody, but if you're a caller, you may come in unmuted. So just double check on your computer or your phone to mute yourself. And if you do need to speak, to click the unmute button. Once again, thank you for attending the BC Hockey video conference. And at this time, I'm going to pass it on to our Chief Program Officer, Jeremy Ainsworth.
Great, thank you, Keegan. First of all, just thanks to everybody for your attendance today. It's always great to see the turnouts that we've been getting. I'm sure you'll find today's session helpful, and as we continue to navigate through the return to hockey. Our focus today is going to be to review the return to hockey template. I know many of you have reviewed that now, and it's an extensive document. It was really designed to assist our members with the development of a comprehensive and safe return for our game. Keep in mind the document's a fluid document. It's based from the province of BC, via sport guidelines, and those may adjust along with the health authority direction. We'll keep you in the know on that. As we find out new items from those groups, we'll pass that along. We really appreciate the input and questions that we received from you this past week. Those are great. And our intent is to address those today and then review some key aspects of that template. Sean Raphael will walk us through that exercise in a moment here, but before I turn things over to him, I also just wanted to provide a couple of updates on future resources that will be coming out in the next couple of weeks. Many of you have had discussions with us with respect to what will the game look like when we actually get back on the ice, and that's a difficult question to answer. We are learning though, and we are producing resources that will help with that. What I have to update you on is that in mid-July, in about 2 weeks' time, Hockey Canada will be set to release materials and resources on seasonal structure. Those will be helpful. We'll do the same thing we're doing now. We'll distribute those, give you a chance to review, submit questions, and then we'll go through those thoroughly. Those resources are going to provide outlines of alternative drill instruction and gameplay formats for when it's allowable. We're also going to review resources and develop resources for off-ice setup and participation. And we'll update you on that front as we progress. We're in the beginning stages of that now, but we believe that an off-ice component to your programming will be important, and we want to be able to arm your associations and coaches with those types of resources. So, you know, as our materials become available, we also know that many great hockey people within our membership will build off of those. So just keep in mind that sharing opportunity. We're going to do our best to create a platform on our website where if you have great resources that you'd like to share, items that you've developed, we can post those for all. The greater the contribution as a hockey community, the better off we'll be because we're all in this together. So keep that in mind. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sean Raphael just to review the return to hockey template. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks everybody for joining us today. And special thanks to those of you that have participated in the review and assisted release of this document at the district association level. As many of you are aware, we're engaging with the membership at the district level regularly, and there was a huge help from everybody in reviewing sort of the phase that we're in right now, and to get resources like this out there. A couple things before we go right into the document itself that I just wanted to share or maybe sort of help set as a framework here. Just as Jeremy mentioned, things are very fluid. We're all aware of the BC Restart Plan moving to a phase 3 recently, and even since the release of this document. But just in discussion with Via Sport and the sports sector and the Health Authority in Hockey Canada, that move from the BC Restart Plan at this point hasn't overly impacted where we are in return to sport. Return to sport ends up being its own branch of the overall move forward process in the province. So there is no real change to what would have been set out and updated to everybody regarding return to sport. So we're still sort of in the second stage or phase 2 of return to sport. That being said, we are having regular dialogue with Via Sport on behalf of the sports sector and hockey specifically. And they're thoroughly reviewing the phase 3 of BC Restart to see how it can impact return to sport and how it can help us through our progression through the sort of transitional measure phase that we're in, that we touched on last membership meeting, and eventually move into the progressively loosened stage. So that's sort of where we are in the status of how all of those moving parts work together. And just as a quick recap that references some of the things that we outlined in the last video conference in regards to what the current stage of return to sport and return to hockey we're in right now. That's still making sure that whatever programming we're planning and the safety guidelines that you're all establishing right now maintain adherence to physical distancing at 2 meters before, during, after activity, that we still have group gathering limits of no more than 50 people, that we're going to be vigilant on increased hand hygiene and general hygiene and sterilization of our facilities and equipment, that symptom screening processes will be in place for our activities, that we do recognize and we have seen even recently more and more indoor facilities opening, and those relationships that are being forged at the local level are crucial to us getting programming going, but that we know that there will be maybe a staggered approach to that around the province. Our activities are essentially being delivered in small groups and sort of in club, or how we would refer to it as in association. There's going to be limits or restrictions of completely no spectators, but that will go from facility to facility. And that we're in a training and fundamental movement phase still. It's no contact, and we're maybe in modified environments as well. So that's a bit of a recap of where we were last video conference and where we remain today, and then sort of how it's all going to relate to the document I'm going to review. So I'm going to reference us all to the website, which Jeremy also mentioned, and the website really is going to stay as our primary hub. And anything on the website that pertains to return to hockey, we're going to keep it as accurate and up to date as possible. As everybody would notice on our homepage, when you land there, we have our regular news feed that usually has as many as 5 articles. The return to hockey updates will remain as the primary item there when you land on our homepage. But additionally, we have an additional section that has the most up-to-date additional resources as well. And as things continue to be released, we'll update this here, and we'll look at expanding this platform as we see more diverse resources made available. The template in particular is still directly available off this first news item when you click Return to Hockey Plan, and it opens up in a web browser as a PDF and can be downloaded. And we understand that a lot of MHAs, even prior to this document, had started their plan. So it's not meant that this is the only resource available to you, but what we've tried to do with this resource is culminate as much information as we have to date to outline at least the minimum standards of what everybody should be considering when they go into the return to hockey plans. We also understand the diverse nature of our membership and how each plan is likely going to have very unique or individual aspects of it as you work with your facilities. So hopefully for many of you, this is ultimately a review, and we apologize if there's any redundancy, but we want to make sure that everybody's very comfortable with this stage of the return to hockey process. As Jeremy mentioned, we have additional resources coming that are looking at program delivery, more seasonal structure, guidelines from Hockey Canada, and this step in the process is crucial here in order for us to appropriately move to those next phases where we're actually talking about hockey activity occurring. So there is an ability for MHAs that want to use this template as their primary source document to include your association logo here, if that helps you in the presentation of the details, especially when you're working with facilities. And in the intro section, there is still links to those primary resources that we have also on our website if you're working directly out of this document and you need quick reference. It also outlines sort of where the areas of responsibility within our 3 primary groups, the government, health authority, via sport, the sports sector, and Hockey Canada, the areas in which we're going to receive the primary guidance on different aspects of our return to hockey. I believe most people will have gone through this process now, but if anyone hasn't, it's important to have this outlined in your membership, the communications officer. And it's valuable to share who that communications officer is with your district association if you're a minor hockey association, or perhaps a league if you're a team that operates within a league structure, say in junior, or with the overall league like CSHL, say if you are an accredited school, just so that there is some open communication that begins to occur as everybody goes through the process. There may be some variables in regards to the responsibilities that the communications officer will hold at a member level, just based on that member's needs. But the bullet points there outline the underlying minimums that Hockey Canada has recommended to have the communications officer be responsible for. The aspect of this return to hockey template that the communications officer plays the biggest role in is the next 2 pages, which is based on facilities. Facilities are obviously our primary partner in the first steps here of return to hockey, and it's important that we have the ability to outline exactly how we get into the buildings. And that's what this document, if not these next 2 pages, are most important to, is gaining access to our buildings again and outlining exactly how the different expectations of returning safely apply to the building we're in. So we understand that for some members, that might mean there's multiple facilities, and this exercise may need to occur multiple times. We've also had lots of discussion at the district level, especially about how some of our members share facilities, especially in communities that are in close proximity. There may be some facilities that regularly provide access to ice for multiple members, and that's where having communications officers in contact with each other and neighboring members can really be beneficial to avoid redundancy and really increase the efficiency of the process of meeting with our facilities. If we recognize that there are some facilities that deal with a lot of our members, we don't necessarily want to put them in a situation where they're having to meet multiple times unnecessarily, and again, to redundancy, where we could approach them as a cohort group, or even through a district association, maybe find a strategy where we can approach a facility on behalf of a larger contingent of members to make sure that everybody's speaking the same language and following the same guidelines. So there's consistency once we have people in the buildings. The first page of the facilities is ultimately an identification process of what access we have within that specific facility. So there's the identification of the name of the facility, so we know exactly what building we're talking about. The aspects and requirements of physical distancing within that facility, knowing that that may vary from building to building. We know that some buildings aren't just ice arenas, they may be aquatic centers as well. There may be gyms, and we may be sharing the space with larger groups of the public. And we want to make sure that we have an understanding of how those guidelines are being communicated to every patron that comes into the building. Also restrictions on numbers. Again, with those buildings that have multiple user groups and multiple amenities, or even potentially public areas, even if it is just an arena, but there's access to multiple ice, we need to know how in those public spaces what the number of people will be that's allowable by that facility. Things like masks and safety requirements or screening walking into the building. It's good to know if that facility specifically requires people to have a mask or other safety protocols before they enter, so we have our participants arriving prepared to the expectations of that facility, knowing that that is a recommended aspect of the government guidelines and isn't necessarily mandatory, but we want to make sure we're honoring the outlines of each facility. Then there's an ability to identify common areas within a facility: main lobby, dressing rooms, shower facilities, spectator areas, public washrooms, that they've identified an area to isolate, designate to isolate people should an illness arise during an activity. If there's multiple ice surfaces, there may be aspects of a facility that we don't have access to immediately upon opening that we may have had in the past. And we want to make sure that not only as members, but our participants also know exactly where they're allowed to go within a facility during their activity, so we don't overrun that facility's capacity. Then there's an ability on the next page, or over the course of just over the next page, to speak specifically to those areas, the main lobby, dressing rooms, and so on, and give even further specific guidelines. If there are access to, say, dressing rooms, if there's limits that that facility is placed on that we can notify or identify what those are. And to Jeremy's comments, we know this process is fluid, and there's an understanding that this document will be fluid as well. And the communications officer may need to update aspects of it as certain restrictions are lifted. Maybe some are even made more stringent based on real-time practices of how things occur in the buildings themselves. So this is where we can get more specific about how we enter the facility and gain access to all the amenities that are required for our programs. You'll notice that the last question of this section is really the only one that references anything about on ice. A lot of this document is really focused again on us getting into the facilities, preparing to deliver programming, and the resources that we have coming next from Hockey Canada in the near future here are really the ones that are going to outline more what the sport itself looks like. But some facilities have started to outline how many people they're permitting physically on the ice. They're not necessarily dictating what the activity looks like per se. That's what the Hockey Canada documents will do. But even having an understanding if a facility has already set those limits will help us as we interact with the next stage of program delivery from Hockey Canada, where we can make sure that we're adhering not only to Hockey Canada's expectations of participant group size, but that it also appropriately fits within the framework of the facilities we're working in. So again, this is where I think the members are going to spend most of their time right now in outlining all of these aspects. So all of this is in order, and there's the ability for a local association board to approve the approach to safety so programming can begin. There's a bit of a checklist here, and in lots of discussions at the district level and with associations that I've been in contact with, this is sort of being looked at as an opportunity to go back several times through the process. We want to make sure everybody's taken into account all of these aspects at a minimum in their preparation and safety planning. But as we see things change or get updated, or new restrictions, definitions become available, that we go back through this checklist to make sure that there's nothing important here that has seen a drastic change that we need to update our participants on. So again, guidelines to physical distancing. If some of those change, going through this checklist will help us identify where we need to update people in regards to how that affects our programming. Numbers of people in facilities. Again, if we have those set out and then new guidelines come out, we want to make sure that our programming is up to date as possible and meets the facility's expectations. Participant arrival and departure. The example I've used here quite often is many associations and members have put into their plans a 15-minute arrival beforehand, and that people should be vacating the facility 15 minutes after activity, which has become a common practice and is recommended. But should, again, something like that maybe see a restriction change to, we want to make sure that that's built into our overall plan of how programming goes on. And then understanding that not all programming is going to look the same. So things like pickup and drop off areas, that they're designated, but we may understand that in some cases with older participants, it might just be the participants that are arriving, where with younger groups or people that may need assistance, say para-hockey programming and such, there may be parents that even if they can't spectate the activity, they may be there to assist our young participants in getting to their activity, and how do we do that appropriately and safely within the facility guidelines. Always considerations to during activity protocols, water bottles, hygiene, extra equipment, or all of those kinds of things that we may not have the access to storage that we've had in the past, that all of these things are outlined in advance to our participants, and that whichever sport activity leaders we have on site, whether it's the coaches, the Hockey Canada safety person, or officials, that they're prepared to help assist with the protocols and that they're updated. And we've got some information coming from Hockey Canada to assist with this as well, as there is an online safety protocol course to be set up through the Respect and Sport type of platform that will be made available to participants and activity leaders in advance of the season, so there's a clear level of communication on what those expectations are, particularly as we know they evolve as we are closer and closer to full-scale activity delivery. We want to make sure that everybody's getting a consistent message on that front. So that's one of the resources we'll see and is currently under development. The last sort of area to start focusing on in part of your plans, although it may not be able to be completed to the full extent, is some administration components, pre-registration for all activities. So no on-site payments, no drop-in programming, particularly at this time, and not that that may occur a lot in our regular programming, but avoiding that right now especially is that much more important to provide a surety to the number of people that we have in our facilities and who's actually participating. It also allows for easier tracking should contact tracing be required if we do find out that there was some type of illness that occurred in or outside activity. More guidelines are going to come out from Hockey Canada, but consideration should be made already regarding flexible payment models or flexible policies regarding refunds or communications in regards to alterations to programming from what may be outlined. We know that a lot of you are attempting to communicate to your customers and your members what programming would look like with an element of uncertainty, and we want to reassure them to the best of our ability that programming is going to best fit the cost to them based on what we're allowed to deliver. And then the last component, this is going to be a constant as everything evolves, but full disclosure of self-screening. There's going to be a responsibility to participants and parents to disclose if they're unwell or they're displaying symptoms, first by just staying home. We don't want to have that be something that we have to analyze at the activity. Everybody should do that self-screening process. However, if it does occur in activity, we have the protocols in place to deal with it. The next section sort of deals with that and sort of making sure that we're starting to build this into our emergency plans. So a couple of basic checkpoints, reference to government guidelines in general, but processes for dealing with disclosing cases. We want to inform teams, associations, whoever the direct deliverer of programming is, if a participant has either become sick or is ill at activity or has refrained from coming to activity, we want to make sure that disclosure is there, so it initiates a process for us to screen them back into activity safely. So in and above the sort of checkpoints that are here as a protocol, any other guidelines that MHAs think are valuable to their participants in the screening process, we encourage people to elaborate on that. And then we do have a sample and resource. So there's a link here at the bottom to the source where these diagrams come from, but the diagrams basically outline the pathway of how we deal with illness if they do occur. Ultimately, if we have any concern about the symptoms or an illness that has arisen, or in particular where there's identified symptoms of COVID-19 where somebody's been removed or kept away from activity, or we know there's a confirmed case of COVID-19, we don't want anybody returning until they've been able to get that physician's note clearing them. We've also compared this in a lot of our discussions to what occurs with the concussion process. So the concussion awareness training tool equips our safety people with a quick reference of trying to identify symptoms of a concussion. And if there are enough there, that somebody is then removed from activity and they return to activity once they've been cleared medically, that they're no longer displaying symptoms or at risk for further damage due to that. It's almost the same type of concept here with this. If there's an identified case of illness and symptoms where somebody's been removed from activity, we would isolate them again with the designated area identified at the facility, and they would be removed from activity until they've had that similar clearance. Or again, if they've identified us externally because they've been kept out of activity due to illness and it didn't necessarily occur or manifest during our programming, or they've tested positive, we'd ask them to continue to monitor their symptoms and their situation and return upon medical clearance. The emergency action plan, there is a link here that goes to a 2-page document from Hockey Canada that has been sort of the mainstay framework for creating the emergency safety plan for programming, whether it's an individual team or an association. And it's still very important to follow those guidelines. And although that document doesn't have COVID-19 specific guidelines in it, this is something that we want to make sure we're adding to these action plans. Part of the action plan is also having emergency safety kits and making sure that we're properly stocked with safety equipment in order to deal with a situation where there may be an illness and activity. There's been a lot of discussion around the Hockey Canada safety person, and that person has been identified as our protocol initiator, for lack of a better term, should an illness arise during activity. So we want to make sure that we don't necessarily, unnecessarily intimidate people from taking on this type of role, but ease their mind in that they're not there to diagnose anything necessarily. They're not there to give the medical opinion. Just like a concussion, they're there to help us take the precaution and appropriately remove somebody from activity if there is an identified risk. The Hockey Canada safety guidelines, as well as guidelines available on the BC government website, have the symptoms of COVID-19 if people aren't already aware of them. Those are something that can be easily put into your emergency action plan. And just like a concussion awareness training tool, that's sort of your screening process that the Hockey Canada safety people should be taking on. So again, it's not meant to overburden them with any more responsibility. It's just simply adding a new protocol to the process, and should something arise that we want one person, just like a communication officer takes charge of this return to hockey plan at the association level, when we're in an individual activity, that Hockey Canada person is the one who takes charge, and we sort of have one focal person who can help us deal with the protocol. So the parts of the document that we've gone through here, obviously a lot of information and a lot that may be review or only small clarifications for those of you that have been engaged with the resource already. But that's the parts we've covered so far are really the extremely crucial parts to helping us move to the next stage of planning, which is what remains in this template. And what we're really awaiting additional resources for to help us build a little bit more what the programming physically looks like. But this template helps us get started down that process. So again, as a review, as I covered at the top before sharing the document, we're in this phase 2, second stage of return to sport, transition measures, all those guidelines and restrictions that I listed off the top. And we're working our way towards the next stage, and that's what BS Sport is currently evaluating on behalf of the sports sector, is how we take that on. And we've heard these kinds of analogies just from RFABC when they were on with us last, from Todd Jackson from Hockey Canada, and that going through these phases isn't like turning on a light switch, it's like turning on a dimmer switch or a dial. There's going to be small stages within each phase. And our goal is really to safely get through each aspect. So we can't necessarily expect to have all the parameters of a new phase ready to go right away as soon as we move into it. But our goal is to eventually fulfill all of those elements as we continue to deliver programming. So really getting in the mindset as MHAs on delivering programming that fit within the guidelines of this transition measure phase is so important. And honestly, delivering program in this phase is so important to our plan, because when we do that, we know exactly how it works, what the logistics are, what the practicalities are. In this section of the template, there's an ability for us to track challenges and successes of delivering programming within these various phases. So should we see progress and move into a new phase of sport delivery where we can advance to some additional programming, but then we do hit a, say, second wave or something, we know that we might be able to just only step back to practices that we've already established in previous phases, rather than maybe looking at an entire shutdown of sport and programming. So going through the process and really embracing these steps as we move along is so important to our overall understanding of how we can safely deliver hockey. So in the back half of this template, we have the ability to, again, cross-reference all of the different restrictions of this particular phase, really outline what our member responsibilities and the overview of us delivering the sport are, and then what aspects the facility is really providing the outline for. And it allows us to take notes and even prepare for the next step, which will be the designing of actual programming delivery. Really, members should be focused on this phase 2 section and beginning workings of phase 3. Obviously, within phase 3, we don't know what all the restrictions will be, so there will be elements of this that will, again, be fluid, and we have to prepare to fill them out. Our eventual goal is to get to phase 4, and hopefully the ability for us to track compliance to all the previous phases will help build the framework on how we get to that new normal in the end. The last area of the template is really something that we won't necessarily be filling out right now. There may be aspects of checking off prior to season to make sure that we have everything in order to begin deliver programming, but it's really the assessment tool. It's our ability to identify if we've been able to deliver programming within all of the guidelines. And like I just mentioned, note those successes, note those challenges that will help us through the next progression. It's an ability for us to share our best practices as well on certain things that we're working. And then when we do identify some of the challenges, you can bring that to us here, submit them just as we've had questions submitted in general to BC Hockey, and we can utilize the network of our membership to come up with some of the best options that have been identified by the members of meeting certain frameworks that we need to deliver hockey. So this is really an exercise of program delivery, and once we're actually in the arenas delivering the programming and updating the necessary aspects of our plans as we see things progress. So that's the outline of this document. Again, we understand that lots of our members will have more robust details in how they're planning to deliver programming and even put their framework together to get into their facilities. But we've identified everything here as a minimum standard of things that we have to make sure we're covering in order to equip your individual boards to approve programming to your members, as well as the accountability that we meet the guidelines of Hockey Canada in order to ensure that we have all of our participants insured in these sanctioned programs. The last thing that I would likely touch on here before passing it off again is to regularly check the website. Feel free to reach out with us at any time, and don't be afraid to ask questions. There are a few questions that came in from the members that I'll cover off just as I close, and give you the best outline that we can on where we're at with certain aspects. But just remember that no questions are off limits when it comes to bringing it to your district association or us directly, and we'll do our best to give the most updated information that we can. So some of our member questions include aspects not so much related to what we just covered. A lot of the questions we got about the template itself, I think we answered in that review. But the additional training provided by the HCSP person, we want to, or to the HCSP person, we want to make sure that we're re-emphasizing that here, that we have resources being developed by Hockey Canada. So there is a COVID-19 e-learning module being developed that'll be available online, and it is meant to educate not only the HCSP person, but any of our activity leaders. So we can expect that kind of additional resource to come out for the masses. Will there be training on donning or disposing of masks and gloves? And this is and the questions about where the responsibilities of having that type of material lies. So a couple of things here, again, to reference back to our emergency safety kits. If they weren't included in those kits already, making sure that they are stocked at an individual team or program level is important. As far as how to use that equipment properly, we're not necessarily the medical experts on that, but the BC Center for Disease Control has some very good resources and very postable diagrams on how to appropriately wash hands for hygiene purposes, don a mask, put on gloves, dispose of them and such. So there's some good resources that are already developed directly from the Center of Disease Control that can be shared with our safety people, or even posted in our arenas at the facilities consent if they haven't already put that up. But just as a reminder, masks and gloves, as outlined on our last video conference, should be added to every emergency kit. It will be the responsibility of the team, but in some cases, MHAs may take it upon themselves to ensure that every team is equipped accordingly, but we shouldn't be relying on facilities by any means to provide these safety measures. That will be the responsibility of our members to make sure that they're ready to react. And then the Hockey Canada University course content that hasn't been confirmed yet may have some further details on how to use that within your emergency plan, but please refer to the Center of Disease Control for proper use of any PPE. Several questions were submitted, so we weren't going to necessarily individually speak to all of them, but several questions regarding gameplay, tournaments, and competition. So one thing to speak about in particular is that the primary focus right now is completing these plans just to get into the buildings. And once we get into the buildings, we know that we're in this next phase of training, essentially, this phase 2 of sport, which is skill development and that. But that doesn't mean that we can't be considering how this regards to gameplay and competition, because doing this stage correctly and in a safe manner that meets all of our guidelines is really what is going to be the conduit to getting us to gameplay, even if that ends up being modified and progressional as well. Thinking once again of that dimmer switch or that dial, where we're going to be aware that everything's going to be released in stages. But in the current stage we're in right now, there isn't consideration to elements of that level of competition. The phase 3 return to sport progressively loosened does start to speak to this, but Hockey Canada's resources that will be initially coming out that Jeremy referenced are again focused on skill delivery and what we're going to be delivering right away in the second stage of sport. But we can expect further guidance on what hockey looks like as we start to embrace gameplay. But I would caution everybody just to not keep that as the focal point right now. The focal point will be really just getting on the ice and having people receive hockey activity that meet the current expectations and guidelines that we have. So that covers our questions that we had in general, beyond anything that was specific to the template that I hope we were able to cover through that review. And I'll pass it back over here to Jeremy for anything to close with.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Really good job walking us through that document and going through questions received by the members. And to that end, again, really appreciate the questions that came in. That's helpful for everybody, including us. I really like to see that the chat on this forum is active right now, and people are discussing their approach as to how they've tackled this document. Great job, everyone. Use those forums. When we post this, of course, this is being recorded, and when we post this, you'll be able to see what other people have done there. Just to close today's session, I again just wanted to really thank everybody for the feedback, the questions, and support. Please continue to know that our door's open. We're happy to discuss any challenges. We'd love to hear about your successes as well, and we will share those with everybody so that you can all be successful. Again, I really hope today's session was useful, and we wish everybody well. We look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks where we've got some exciting material coming out your way soon. But until then, please be well and take care. Goodbye, everyone.